Hi, lovely to see you on a day like this. I hope the temperature is acceptable. If anybody feels the need to have a drink or whatever, please go ahead and do it to keep yourselves well hydrated. Welcome to the York Festival of Ideas. My name's John Local from the university, and I'll be chairing this event today and talking with Paul. It's a real pleasure to introduce Paul today, author, linguist and language blogger. Many of you will know him from his Twitter feed, from his language blog. He was born on South Tyneside and he studied English language at the University of Newcastle before completing a master's degree there in language and linguistics, specialising in historical linguistics, etymology of place names and psycholinguistics.
That makes me sound very good.
I know, it's quite a, yeah. His research into the origins of local place names inspired his first book in 2012, The British Isles, a Trivia Gazetteer. And his long-term interest in etymology inspired his second books, Haggard Hawks and Paltry Poltroons, which was named as one of The Guardian's best language books of the year. Are you blushing yet?
Despite that title as well. I've never liked that title.
No. If you haven't read it, you really should. It's a really good read. In 2013, Paul also set up the popular Twitter account @HaggardHawks, which now boasts more than 92,000 followers. Both it and its tie-in blog and website have become a mainstay of the online linguistic community. Paul also appears weekly on BBC Radio Newcastle.
Yeah.
And what we hope to do today is to explore some of the nuts and bolts of language and just talk about some of the weird and wonderful things and try and answer some questions that you've probably never thought of asking. So without more ado, Paul, one of the reasons is this fantastic book. Why is this a question? We'll leave that moment and let's just start asking you a real question.
Okay.
What is a language?
Oh, right, okay. Hitting the ground running. So the problem with that in English is that the word language does two jobs.
Yeah.
So we use language in English to mean all language, human capacity to communicate. And we also use it to mean a specific language, like French or English or German or whatever. And not every other language has that problem, but English definitely does. French doesn't, for instance. So you kind of have to resolve, well, which one of those two questions are you asking? Because one of them is really easy to answer. Human communication is it's a structured, kind of codified system that's based on speech. So it has rules, so we all basically kind of sound the same and follow the same kind of patterns. And it's speech-based because speech predates writing. There is a theory that it's maybe started off with gesture primacy theory, but it's a little bit questionable. We'll get around to that eventually. But that's kind of language in and of itself. A language is it's much, much harder to define because the problem is that there's this rival term dialect. And so if you say, well, this language is this and this language is this, where on that kind of scale does a dialect fit in? The usual sort of theory is what's called mutual intelligibility. So if I can understand you, we are speaking the same dialect despite differences.
Yep. Despite coming from different sides of the river.
Yeah, I know. North and South Tyneside is bad, this.
Yeah.
We shouldn't really be talking anything.
No.
Despite what differences it might be, we can still understand each other. So we're speaking the same language, just different dialects of it. Quite closely intertwined dialects as it happens, but different dialects. Whereas if we couldn't understand one another, we'd just say, well, we're speaking different languages. I'd be speaking English, you could be speaking Russian or something.
Yeah.
The problem with that is that when you start rolling that definition out around the world, there are lots and lots of things that we would think of as languages that don't follow that rule, and there are lots of things that we would think of as dialects that don't fit that rule. So the classic example is Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish, which are so intertwined that a Norwegian person speaking to a Swedish person speaking to a Danish person, each speaking their own language, could probably have a pretty serviceable conversation. Same goes with kind of Spanish and Portuguese to a certain extent. Even Spanish and Italian, I think, is about sort of 50% overlap quite often. So they are much more closely related than we might expect different languages to be, but we would think of them as different languages. So the problem is of this rule of mutual intelligibility is it kind of starts to fall down on kind of where you draw the line. If languages behave like dialects, then what is a dialect? And quite often a lot of the things that we think of unquestionably as languages haven't kind of earned that title on linguistic grounds. It's been more social, political, that kind of thing.
What are you thinking about?
Italian is the good example of that. When Italy unified, you suddenly had all these sort of disparate city-states and things coming together. The newly unified government wanted a new national language, and so really randomly picked Florentine as the new kind of standard, because that was the one that Dante had written in and all the rest of it. But that suddenly made kind of dialects, quote unquote, out of things like Venetian and Sicilian and Sardinian and Piedmontese and all these sort of regional things, which up until then had been their own languages in their own territories. Yeah. So you've got this kind of, so when you learn Italian, you're actually learning Florentine Italian or Florentine Italian. So what you think of as Italian kind of isn't. It's kind of this thing that we now think of as a language has been picked politically. Same thing happened in Albania. After the revolution, a new government came in, ousted the previous national standard that was in the dictionaries and things and put their own dialect in instead. They just, because they could. Yeah. It was that kind of thing. Yeah. So you kind of, what you think of as being kind of the national language of that place kind of isn't.
Yeah. So
for any linguistic reason.
Asking a question like, what is a language?
Yeah.
Is one of these things, like lots of questions about language and languages, that's much more tricky to answer than you would think when you started off.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was writing the book, I thought, I'll ask that question, what is a language? And then I had kind of suddenly worked out I actually had to write that up. And you can't. It's like, you can't. Same thing with what is a word. No one can tell you what a word is.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to cover those nuts and bolts, but there's no kind of one answer to it.
What do you think a word is?
I think...
We haven't rehearsed any of this.
So I think you kind of can't say, really. It's one of these terms that really doesn't... Everyone knows instinctively what a word is. You can count the words on a sheet of paper. You know that I'm saying individual words here. If I asked you to write down a random word, you wouldn't write a sentence. You wouldn't write a clause. You wouldn't write a letter. You would know what to write. So everyone kind of instinctively knows what it is. But as soon as you try to pin down a definition that works, especially across different languages, you kind of can't. It just doesn't work. It either lets in too many things that we know aren't words, or it excludes things that we know are words. And plus, if you've got, I don't know, hot dog, is that 2 words? Is that 1 word? Is it 3? Because a hot dog isn't a hot dog. No. Even weirder is something like that. Is that 1 word on its own? Is that 2 words? Is it 3 kind of weirdly bundled together? If you set a word counting program going, it would tell you that was 1 word. But we kind of know that it's technically 2. Yeah. So is it really 3? So it's that kind of grey area. And whatever definition that you kind of attach to it, you can kind of say that it's a unit of language that operates on its own. Some people add that if you were to write it down, you would put spaces around it. But again, that doesn't work in every language. So there are lots of ways that you can kind of define it. But in practice, it's not a particularly useful word, ironically, to use. It's sort of just... It's too vague to really be used in any kind of technical sense. Yeah. So, we all know, but to tell you what it is, I don't know.
And one of the tests for this, as you said, is if you try to write a computer program to recognize stuff, it becomes very, very difficult.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that certainly it comes out of your book is that a lot of these questions around language are really problematic because we do language all the time. We think we know what's going on. Mm-hmm. We learn other languages. Yet there's sort of myths about it. I regularly, as an ex-academic, get sent questions by people. And one of the questions that I get sent is one which you ask in this book. Mm-hmm. And it's essentially, what is the hardest language to learn? And that is a really weird question, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Weirdly as well, that was the one that gave me the kind of kick up the backside to actually write this book. Because I've had that idea for, honestly, like nearly 9 years or something. I wrote a blog years ago about the origin of the word 11. And part of it sounds really boring, but it's a lot more interesting than I'm making it sound. but part of the kind of story that's involved in that, I kind of had to talk about how number systems actually operate in languages in general.
I want to talk to you about that.
All right, okay, well, yeah, we're going to that. So, so I had to do that, and that kind of gave me the idea of actually, when you ask a question like, why isn't 11 a teen? Instantly you want to know the answer to that. So it kind of acts as like a sort of gateway into quite a complex topic, like number systems in languages, but you can kind of dress it up in a way that makes people go, all right, okay, actually, yeah, I do want to know this. And so then during, fast forward like 7 or 8 years or whatever it was, during lockdown, when I first started writing this and everyone was learning languages because no one had anything to do apart from bake bread and download Duolingo, suddenly I was seeing all these articles in newspapers and blogs and things of people going, the hardest language to learn is, and they were all getting it wrong. They were all getting like telling completely the wrong story. The number of them that were saying, Japanese, because it's the one that's sort of furthest, I guess you could say, from English. But you can't do that because I have a friend of mine, his mom was born in Tokyo, he speaks Japanese. So it's not going to be hard for him. It's something that changes person to person. It's something that changes based on languages you already know. And the concept of difficulty is the only thing that you can really address with that, because there are lots and lots of things that we do in English, for instance, that if you spoke a different language from the outside in, if you were looking at it, you'd go, that's really weird, that must be really difficult.
Yeah.
The difference between the dental fricatives, the TH sounds in English. We have 2 different ones, voiced and unvoiced. And if we didn't know the difference, then the old pronoun thy, and the thigh in your leg, we wouldn't be able to tell those 2 words apart.
Yeah.
So we all know how to do that. Worldwide, it's less than 10% of languages have that distinction. So if you speak a language that doesn't do that, outside looking in on English, you go, that's really weird. I don't know why people do that. It must be so hard to pick those 2 words apart. To us, it's the most normal thing in the world.
Yeah. Well, likewise, I guess you say, why is this a question? English does weird things with questions. That are very rare.
Yeah. We have 3 ways of forming questions. We can use a question word, we can use intonation, and we can shuffle the order of the words around in a sentence. So if you've got something like, you are going, we can move the verb and the subject around. Are you going? That becomes a question. And that's the most natural, normal thing in the world. That we do that every single day. But worldwide, that feature, subject auxiliary inversion, as it's called, has been found in less than 1% of the world's languages that have been studied so far. I put that up on Twitter and everyone called me a liar because it seems so weird. And of course you do it in French and you can do it in German and you can do it in lots of European languages. But this little pocket of Western Europe that allows this, there's 7,500 languages in the world. The fact that you can do it in sort of 10 sort of is a little blip. And it's been found in a couple around the world. It's been found in a couple of South American languages, for instance. But worldwide, that's not how languages tend to form sentences. Most languages, when they need to form a sentence, will add a sentence particle. Yeah. So you'll say a perfectly normal sentence, and then you'll tag this thing into it somewhere, or you'll inflect one of the words in some way to transform it into a question that way. We don't do that, of course. We have lots of other methods, but we don't do that. But that's how most languages form questions. So this really normal thing that we do, outside looking in, again, you kind of go, well, that's really weird. Yeah. So that kind of undermines any concept of difficulty. If you've got this thing that's just normal to you, it isn't difficult. No. So it's very, very strange. You kind of have to turn it around on itself. Yeah. The point that I make at the end of that chapter is there's a brilliant language called Jemes, which is spoken in, I think it's New Mexico, and they have a feature called inverted number when they need to pluralize things. So in English, we need to pluralize something. 9 times out of 10, you put an S on the end of it. A couple of odd outliers here and there, but that's mostly like what we do. Yeah. But in Jemes, they have this feature where every single noun is either inherently singular or inherently plural already. So you learn that one form, and then you tag onto the end of it the plural marker if you're using the other one. So the word for person is po in this language. The word for people is posh, because the plural marker is an SH sound. The word for drums, plural, is pa. The word for drum is pash. So you add the number on it to cancel out kind of what's grammatically expected. So the rule of thumb in that language is you only pluralize something if the number of them that you need to talk about is somehow grammatically unexpected.
Yeah.
That's the kind of rule. So to us, we just like, well, we've got one of those, now we've got lots of them, so you change the word. In that language, you have to understand the inherent number of things and then cancel it out somehow with this marker.
Yeah.
So
And the speakers of that language have no problem with that.
Exactly,
do they?
that's the thing, yeah.
Absolutely no
So
problem.
the kind of conclusion of that chapter on difficulty, I kind of go, it's so easy to sit on the outside and go, good grief, look at that.
Yeah.
But if that chapter had been written in Hemis and that was being used all the way through, you could write it and go, good grief, look at English, look how weird it is. So it's too flexible a kind of a concept difficulty. It changes depending on what your personal circumstances are. It changes from one language to the next based on what you already know, and it changes based on the language that you're thinking about difficulty in.
Yeah.
So you kind of it's like Word. You kind of can't pin it down. It just doesn't work.
You mentioned, as we were talking, 11. And I'm now going to ask you a personal question. I have a 5-year-old grandson who asked his father why 11 and 12 didn't end in teens. And
Yeah.
I think you might be able to say something about this.
Yes, yeah. The weird thing about this is that we have a decimal number system, obviously, so everything sits in nice, neat sets of 10, apart from 11 and 12. It just kind of, they're just these odd sort of outliers. And so when I was writing about the etymology of that, if you take it far back enough, that kind of V that's in both of those words is left over from, it's kind of weirdly, very, very distantly related to things like relic, things left behind. So 11 is literally the number where you get to 10, and then you've got 1 left. And 12 is the one where you've got 2 left after 10. So that's the kind of etymological story of it. But that doesn't solve the problem of why they're like that.
Yeah.
So the issue with that is that comes down to, like I say, about how number systems work. Our language is decimal. There are elements of base 20 in French, for instance, when it's sort of, what was it, 4 20s and 10 for 90, that kind of idea. So there are lots and lots of different base systems around the world. And so there was, for a long time, a theory that English maybe had an element of base 12. And this was a theory in the kind of 19th century. And it's sort of backed up by real-world examples of languages that take unusual base systems and just run with them. There are languages that are in base 37. So you'd count to 37, and then you'd go back and you'd start, everything sits in these odd sort of systems. There's a brilliant language, I think it's called Miranya, which is spoken in New Guinea, where you start off counting on your fingers, and then you go to your wrist, the mid part of your arm, your elbow, this, across your facial features, down the other arm, and then it goes down the middle of your body to end below the waist, shall we say. The last, I won't tell you what the last number is, you can look that up. But so you end up counting unusual bodily markers in their number system, and then you go back to start and you start counting on this finger again. And I think that's in base 48, something like that. So there's all these really bizarre number systems around the world. So did we used to use one of those? Well, it's kind of like, yes, but no. The reason why 11 and 12 is different, we know now, is just because it's a really practical one. It's because it's arithmetically much more useful than 10. Yeah. 10, you can split it in half, or you can split it up into 5 sets of 2. That's it. 12, you can split it up into 2, into 3, into 4, into 6. 24, you can do even more with than 20. 100, you can't do as much as you can with 144. I'm not fast enough with maths to tell you how you can divide those up. But it's because of this kind of arithmetic, this idea that you can do more with those sorts of numbers. Yeah. If your world is about sharing things out equally, about counting things up, that kind of thing. Distribution, for instance, is a big kind of aspect of that. A number that you can do more with is obviously going to be much more useful. So there are separate words for 11 and 12 just because we needed those quantities more than we needed 10. And it's still the same now. We still talk about dozens and gross and all the rest of it. Yeah. And so we have separate words for these numbers. We don't have a separate word for 17 because we've never needed it. So etymologically, there is a reason why they like that. it would be lovely if we had a very bizarre base system in English, but we don't.
Yeah.
So it's just the fact that it was their kind of mathematical usefulness that made us sort of set them apart and then built up the rest of the number system around them.
When I was a teacher many, many years ago, I used to have the children count in threes by counting the that I saw in a book about 40, 50 years ago. And it said, there are some bits in India where people enumerate by counting their knuckles.
Yeah.
And you think, that is, you know, as you say, it's just really odd to us.
Yeah.
But not them.
Yeah, and mathematically, it's this is the thing as well as that people. Sorry, I get sidetracked. I warned you about this. People say, well, you know, if you can count to 10 on your fingers, why use base 12 instead? You just use your knuckles.
Yeah.
There are base 4 and base 8 languages where instead of counting your fingers, you count the gaps in between. Yeah. So you can still count on your fingers. It's just in a different way to the way we're used to doing it. So it's really easy to kind of go, well, that's really strange. But there's still a perfectly sensible kind of system underneath it all.
I think a really interesting thing about this is it makes you question what normal is.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, because there is no normal.
No.
There is just lots and lots of really exciting and interesting diversity.
Yeah.
Manage communication and, you know, manage social interactions.
Yeah.
And I've just been watching you waving your hands around. You mentioned earlier, you know, about gesture and speech.
Yeah.
And do you want to say anything about aquatic?
Oh, God. Right. So
Which you also
the
mentioned.
problem is that I get very self-conscious when I start talking about hand gestures.
Yeah.
It's the last chapter in the book, but it was the first one that I wrote because it's the one that I had absolutely no experience of. I'd never studied it at all. So it was kind of my own acid test that if I could understand this and explain it and kind of work my way through it, then I could kind of write all the rest of it. And I thought I'd write it in a couple of weeks, and I think it took 6 months. It's so complex, and it's absolutely fascinating and we're just understanding what's happening with gestures. If you ask someone why people move their hands, in this sort of situation where you're kind of commanding an audience, which is what I'm doing right now, it's all about, people will say that it's about confidence and it's about making yourself visually appealing and all the rest of it. This is not how we normally converse with one another. When we were sat downstairs having a coffee, I wasn't sat doing all of this, at least I hope I wasn't. So there is an element of that when you're in front of an audience. But in ordinary conversation, we still use gestures. So it's not about commanding attention when it's just us two sat at a table. And what we're finding out is that gestures fall into lots and lots of different categories. There are what are called iconic gestures, which is where you actually mime whatever it is you're talking about. So you might talk about a river or something, or a ladder, or whatever it might be. There's metaphoric gestures where if you've got someone, I don't know, talking about, someone will say something like, oh, I used to do this. At the minute he's doing this and he wants to do that. This means nothing. That what you're talking about there is the passage of time. You can't draw that. You can't mime that out. So why are we doing this? That doesn't. We're not pointing at anything. Yeah. So that's a metaphor. It's like, it's a metaphoric gesture. It's just it feels like there's some sort of movement going on. Again, that's not language centric. There are some languages that think of time passing that way and think of the future being behind rather than in front, as we do. But there are gestures that accompany things that are intangible. And there's all sorts of different things. There's deictic gestures, which is where you just point at things. There are what are called co-speech beats, which you'll find public speakers doing a lot, which is where you do this on the most important words. Yeah. So there's a sort of musical kind of attribute to that. But the more people have researched this, the more we're kind of finding out that it's completely embedded into how we communicate. Yeah. There's a brilliant study that was done in the late 90s, I think, which sounds very bizarre, which was done at Colgate University, New York, where to find out what happened if you can't gesture, they actually strapped people into chairs and kind of kept their head straight forward and they could not move at all. And two things happened in this study. The first is that their facial expressions went wild. So when you can't move, suddenly your eyes are darting around and you open your mouth much further than normal. So there's something physical, obviously, still trying to get out. apart from, holding someone's face, solid.
Suffering,
Yeah, I don't think there's many places you could kind of test that otherwise. There's still something that's trying to get out. The other thing that happened, though, is that people made more errors. They were stumbling over their speech more. They were getting the wrong words. They were making all sorts of different mistakes, saying something and then realizing it wasn't true and going back. And when they analyzed the transcripts of what was actually said in those experiments under these really bizarre kind of circumstances, a lot of the words or the vast majority of words that people were stumbling on were words to do with things like physical activity, location, position, sports even. So they were all kind of words to do with movement and position and your kind of sense of place in the kind of environment around you. So it seems like gestures, as much as we're kind of doing this so that we look a little bit bigger physically in front of an audience, when you're just talking to someone else, there is an element of, actually, this helps you kind of work out where you are, and it gives you a kind of reference point to work from. You don't need to strap someone into a chair to kind of test this out for yourself. Get someone to describe their route to work, but get them to do it sitting on their hands, and they'll make mistakes. Yeah. If you ask someone to describe, how their kitchen's laid out, the first thing they'll do is go, well, you come in the door here, and there's something. Instantly, you get people to sit on their hands or put them in their pockets, they'll go, right, well, on the left. Suddenly that kind of connection stopped. Yeah. So there's something kind of really kind of buried deep down in this. Yeah. The study that showed this is that evolutionary biologists, some of them will say that this is an extension of gill flaps from when we were all in a big primordial soup and we didn't have language. So we do this now because fish used to do that. Used to do that because that was the only way that they could communicate to one another. I read that study and kind of parsed it in my own head, and I sent it across to a really good friend of mine who's a biochemist at Edinburgh University. And I was like, is this really what this means? And he was like, yeah. That's what people now think. So there is a kind of evolutionary aspect to it as well, that it's so hardwired because it's once all that we had. Yeah. That was all that we had.
And it's interesting because you can see people on telephones where the other person isn't there and they're gesturing.
Yeah.
And, I do it.
Yeah.
And for anybody that wants to look, I don't know if you've seen, there's this little video of a 2-year-old Italian girl that you can find if you search YouTube and search Italian child gestures. It's wonderful. She has all the cultural gestures for Italian, and she's arguing with her mother.
That's amazing.
And I think, the point that you make, that this is part of the communication system. It's not an add-on.
Yeah.
It's part of, the brain is driving the whole system.
Absolutely, yeah. And there are linguists who will say that this is called paralanguage or paralinguistics. So all of this stuff outside of the actual words that we use that still communicates things and shapes what we use. There are some people who say that it isn't part of linguistics. I think it has to be.
I think it has to be as well.
Absolutely has to be.
Yeah.
There are fields like oculesics, which is to do with eye movement, how that alters what you're saying. There's things called haptics, which is to do with physical contact, how that can change what you're saying. The kind of classic example is if you say to someone, the example I use in the book is, you can't go to your friend's birthday party. So you have to say, I'm not going, 3 words. You're going to tilt your head. You might put your hand on their hand. You're going to speak slow. You're going to speak soft. You might put your eyebrows to one side. There's all this sort of stuff that makes it kind of conciliatory. I'm sorry, but that kind of stuff. You take the same 3 words and you put that into, you're at work and someone's told you to go somewhere that you really don't want to go. You go, well, I'm not going.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same 3 words. If you transcribe that conversation, there's nothing different. Yeah. But suddenly you might be folding your arms, looking away, stiffening your back. Yeah. All this other stuff's completely changed what you said. Yeah. Same 3 words in both situations, completely different interpretations. Yeah. So it has to be linguistic. It has to be. It has to be an aspect of how we communicate to one another and how we shape the words that we use.
Yeah, I think that's so deeply embedded in what we do that, of course, everybody is now looking at their hands and sort of.
I know. I got really self-conscious while I was explaining that. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to be selfish again. I'm going to ask another question, which my grandchild asked me And you actually answer it in the book, so you can answer it for the audience as well. He's being taught to read learning phonics, so you're sounding out letters phonetically. And he said, Gramps, why is there a dot over I? Because there's a dot over I and a dot over J. And I have to say, I was ashamed that I did not know. Would you like to tell us?
Yeah, so this is...
I think this is great.
This is one of these ones where I really wanted to answer. When I was first kind of putting the book together, I thought it'd be lots and lots and lots of short questions. I thought there'd be about 60, 70 really short, punchy sections. And this was one of them that made me go, actually, no, I can't do that. Because if you explain why... To explain why there's a dot over I, you have to explain why we have upper and lowercase letters at all. And to explain that, you have to explain how handwriting works.
Yeah.
And to explain that, you have to kind of address what happened in Europe in terms of styles of handwriting. And to explain that, you know, explain how the languages are all it kind of embedded in with one another. So that's why I was like, oh, okay, actually, no, these need to be longer, fewer chapters, but longer explanations. The thing with I, if you look back in the kind of history of handwriting, especially in Europe, is that we used to write in minims, which are these little flicked quill symbols. It's a kind of, it gets wrongly called either Gothic writing or Old English writing, which is that really thick black letter kind of text. And at that time, a lot of stuff that was written down was written in Latin, which has lots and lots of neighboring letter I's, especially in plurals and things. And if you do two minims, two of these sort of single strokes, it looks a bit like a U. It doesn't look like an I at all. It doesn't look like two I's. In some contexts, it looks a bit like half of an N. It looks a little bit like an M. And if you're cramping lots and lots of words onto one line, spacing at that point wasn't really that much of an issue either. Suddenly, the word for intelligent people, genii, suddenly looks like genu, which means knee. It's a completely different word. So these dots started to emerge to go, right, well, this is actually just a single character. This one stroke is a single character. I'm going to put a dot above it to show that it's a single one. And I'm going to put two dots above it to show that there's two. So it's a way of kind of differentiating one letter from others that look a little bit like it. From there, we adopted it into all the other kind of languages of Europe, and that's why we do it. J has a dot over it because J came from I much, much later on. But yeah, it's all to do with handwriting. It's all to do with clarifying those two neighboring I's in black letter text.
And of course, I have to ask you the question now, because I'm sure there are a number of people who will have read the blurb for today. Why is the alphabet in the order that it's in?
This is another one of these ones where I was like, that's a great question, I'll answer that. Not for 1 minute thinking that I'd actually then have to do it. And it's impossible to answer it. I'd never seen anyone ask that question or answer it before. So I thought, yeah, I'll do that. And then you start researching, it's like, oh, okay. Because what you want with that question is a silver bullet. What you want is an explanation that goes, this is the reason why these letters are in this order. What you've got instead for about half of the letters of the alphabet are lots and lots and lots of individual stories. There is an explanation, like we just said, I and J are cousins. J developed from I. So they sit next to each other because they were intertwined. You go back 100 years, I've got a dictionary at home that's from 1910, and the I and J words are lumped under the same section. So they've always been kind of intertwined, so they sit next to each other. That's one letter. That's one explanation of why that happened. And you can do that for F, you can do it for G, you can do it for Z, you can do it for U, V, and W. There are all these individual letters that have stories attached to them, some more complex than others. Z is that's a wild ride. It took a long time to find its place. But for the other half of the alphabet, the thing you've kind of got to remember is that we took our alphabet from the Romans, from Latin. The Romans took it from the Etruscans, who lived further south in Italy. The Etruscans took it from the Euboean Greeks, who took the Greek alphabet across to Italy. The Greeks took it from the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians used their system based partly on probably Sinaitic dialects in the Middle East, plus Egyptian hieroglyphs. So you've got 6, 7, 8 different cultures all desperately trying to use the same system, and none of them doing it particularly well because they're just inheriting it. But you go back through all of that time, back to the Phoenician alphabet, which is about 4,500, 5,000 years ago. The oldest record of an alphabet, I guess you could say, that we have a kind of record of. And right in the middle of it, there's a letter that looks a bit like K. and next to it is a letter that looks a bit like L, and next to it is a letter called Mem that looks a bit like M, and next to that is one that looks a little bit like N called Nun. So 4,000, 5,000 years ago, there's those letters kind of still there. That nothing's changed them like the other stories. So that part of the alphabet, those other kind of 13 letters, B is one of them as well. We kind of don't really know. They've been set in stone for so long that we have theories, and there's been some really tantalizing discoveries to kind of explain it. In the 50s, I think it was, a whole load of stone tablets were found in a Bronze Age site on the coast of Syria with the stock alphabet written in cuneiform, so not in letters that we would recognize, but the sounds matched our alphabet, written out in this stock order that we would recognize as the bones of our alphabet, over and over and over and over again on dozens and dozens and dozens of tablets. What does that suggest? Well, it was probably being actively taught at that point to children, maybe, to scribes, certainly, translators, maybe. How do you make people remember something in a stock order? Probably a mnemonic at some point. There's maybe a story attached to it. There was maybe an acrostic poem, something like that. There's maybe a rhyme. There's been a clue that the first two letters were a kind of equivalent to father and grandfather in the language that was in use there. So maybe there was some kind of word association thing going on. So there's these really tantalizing clues, but until we find that one document that says, I'm going to teach the alphabet to these people in this order because of this.
Yeah.
Until we find that, we kind of haven't got a full explanation of why it was there. Certainly clues, but we don't know.
Yeah. I would like to think that someday we'll get closer to these answers. But I like your way of saying there are some really interesting mysteries here. And we can think in interesting ways about them and what the implications of it is. And I'm very much taken with the idea that there are lots of mythology there about language. And facts about language. And it turns out that quite a lot of the facts aren't facts.
No.
And how do you feel about that? Because I mean, you've in your book, you're writing about stuff like this, and presumably you're trying to correct some of this stuff.
I think that's a good point. I think as well that it's probably kind of coming from me writing about etymology. A lot of the times you kind of end up at a dead end, and you have to end up with a question mark and go, well, I don't know. You kind of that has to be your conclusion because there's just no more evidence. And that's kind of that. I think it's easy to think, well, that's not very good. You want a conclusion to the story, but I think it's just as interesting that we don't know. I think it's just as interesting that the kind of trail just sort of runs out, and that's where you can start to kind of add conjecture into it. So I think the fact that there are things that we still don't know and there are still mysteries, I think, is kind of tantalizing. In terms of kind of redressing facts, the problem is, I think, quite often when you get to that situation and there isn't an easy explanation, or the trail does run out, is people start going, I bet it's this. And then they'll start writing that as like fact. They'll go, well, actually, I bet it was this. And they'll come up with a theory, and then without kind of questioning it, it'll start to sort of get circulated around about why one thing was one way. So there is as much in that book of kind of holding your hands up and going, well, we've kind of reached the end of the trail here. There is as much a kind of aspect of maybe myth-busting things a little bit. A lot of it, I think, comes down to the very, very first thing I was ever taught when I started studying linguistics was that there's no such thing as right and wrong. There is a standard, and there are things that are non-standard. That's it. Nothing is wrong. It's kind of baked into your head that you get things wrong in English, and I was always a terrible speller. I still am. You get used to this idea of that's wrong. Technically, it's just non-standard when I get a word when I get a word misspelled.
I'm with you there.
That was the first thing that I was ever taught, and it kind of blew my mind a bit. And that's one of those things that you do have to kind of challenge it. I think quite often, especially in where we are at the minute in terms of a lot of discussions of things, whenever there are new words added to the dictionary, there's always this sort of pearl-clutching editorial come out going, it's the death knell of the English language. They've added selfie to the dictionary. And it's like, well, because people are using it. It's not, it's not a bad word. It's the job of the dictionary to record what people are doing in the language, not tell people what they should be doing.
Well, I think it's exciting also to see words like medal, summit, and souvenir being used as verbs now.
Yeah.
You can souvenir something,
Yeah.
which essentially means you pinched it. And you will hear athletes saying, "I podiumed."
Yeah.
And you think, wow,
Yeah.
this is really exciting.
Yeah. And this is the thing, though, is that certain people will hear that and go, "Oh, I don't like that."
Yeah.
But if you blanket something,
Yeah.
that was always only ever a noun. Shakespeare made that into a verb.
Yeah.
So, and people go, "Oh, he's great."
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, they'll use that one.
Yeah.
Cake is another one that was always a noun until things are caked in it, and I think it was Shakespeare as well that turned that one into a verb.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's the flexibility aspect of it, and things have kind of got to move on. So getting part of the myth busting in the book is to kind of go, well, yeah, people don't like that, but it's fine. It's fine. The one that does, I have to admit, stick in my craw a little bit is literally to mean figuratively.
Yes. Yeah.
I was watching a travel program the other day, and I was genuinely, the person presenting it went, "Everyone should go to Cornwall at least once. It'll literally blow your socks off." And I was like, what happens on the border of Devon? I don't know what's happening.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that one still kind of maybe sticks out a little bit with me. I do it myself all the time, but that's one that I'm kind of like, oh, okay, that's one change that I'm kind of, all right, yeah.
I think you're allowed to have your prejudices as long as you suppress them.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's that, I think it's our job as linguists is to be descriptive, not prescriptive. Talk about what people are doing, not tell them what they should be doing. But in the same way that you can kind of dislike the prose of a particular author, I think you can still have opinions about things.
Absolutely.
So long as you realize that your opinions are completely pointless.
Yes.
There is no point to having an opinion about, whether you like an accent or not.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. There is no point to that opinion whatsoever.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can still kind of be a little bit kind of objective with things, but so long as you realize it makes no sense to have that feeling at all.
And on that upbeat point, I think now is the time to get some questions. Yes, questions. Here we go. I think there's a microphone coming round.
Hello.
Hi.
Very, very interesting, yeah. Well, I'm interested in accents, and Britain is a real accented country. Liverpool, Manchester, the south, the north. I've got Essex A's and Northern U's. I don't have a York accent at all. I've lived here for about 40 years. I don't have a York accent. That's got a Pacific accent. And then... and then there's, you can play about with words. I'll just say very quickly. There's Thin Lizzy, a famous pop group, and the Irish call it Tin Lizzy because they can't say THs, you see. So it's very clever. Yeah, very play on with words, And the other thing is tonal languages and difficult languages. Like Chinese is very difficult. That's a tonal language. Norwegian, that's a tonal language as well. That's very difficult. And Polish, nothing like Russian.
Yeah.
That's a difficult language to learn as well. And English is difficult language.
Yeah.
There's no rules for English. You don't have male and female words. It's not like Latin, which is quite. It's very good for spelling Latin.
Yeah.
And you've got Spanish, Portuguese, all similar. Well, you've got grazie and gracias, and I can't speak either of those two, but you can sort of use your sense, can't you?
Between them. Yeah.
Yeah.
The interesting thing, one of the examples that I use in the book of how things are interconnected is what's called a dialect continuum.
Yeah.
And we're used to going, well, this area speaks this, and this speaks this, and this speaks this. Same like what you're saying about Spanish and Portuguese and how that all interconnects. There's a continuum that goes all around the Romance languages, from sort of Sicily right around to Portugal. And if you speak Sicilian, you'll notice it's different from standard Italian. And you go slightly up the coast, you'll hear a slightly different version of that, and go up the coast to a slightly different version of that. And so on that route, it kind of feels like one language is just sort of merging all into the same thing. But from Portuguese to Italian, you'd go, well, they're different languages. So at opposite ends, you've got languages, but on the way, you've just got one long chain of dialects. So where do you draw the line with that? It's very strange when you talk about how languages are kind of interconnected with one another. Yeah.
And I think that the tonal language thing is really interesting because as people know, if you do different tones in Chinese, ma, 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 all mean different things.
Yeah, I'm glad you did that. No.
but if you use pitch in the same way in English, for instance, if we asked people to write down what I'm going to say now, I don't know. But if I ask you what to write down now, I don't. No. Right? You're going to write two different words down at the end, and that's managed largely by pitch and pause. So I mean, languages are really intricate, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely. One of my last studies that I did when I was an academic was about ambiguity. So if I asked you to write down the word or, most people would write or.
Yeah.
Some people would write OAR because that's a solid object.
Yeah.
Nobody would write AWE because it's so completely off-brand. It's something you can't see, and the spelling is really bizarre. But some people would write ORE. So you've got one sound or four completely different spellings. Then the way that you interpret it, it's partly based on frequency. So you hear the word OR much more than you do AWE. Yeah. So that one's probably top of your list. Yeah. And then the idea of tangibility comes in next. So you can see an or, but you can't see or. So it's difficult, there's this kind of messy system of kind of different factors that makes you choose one word over another. Yeah. Like that I don't know. Yeah, you've got two different words there, no. Which one are you going to write down? In that instance, based on tone, like you say. Yeah. But out of all context, which one are you going to pick? Yeah. If I had to ask you to write down the word no, which one would you pick? Yeah. Chances are you wouldn't pick the one that's got a silent K at the start of it, to be fair.
That's true. And you might, I once tried to do an experiment like that, because you know that no means yes, don't you? If it follows a negative statement. I don't like things, do you? You know, I don't like gin, do you? No, I don't. Which means yes, I do. So, it's kind of, these really intricate little things going on. Yeah. Questions? Questions. Yeah. Loads of them. Can we come over here?
Hi.
Thank you.
If you were asked a stupid question, what's your favourite word?
Ooh.
What would you answer?
I change my mind every single time I'm asked this. One word that I do keep coming back to, which I love, possibly because I live in Newcastle and we're on a river, is transpontine, which is... it used to be called prepositional adjectives, but that's something different now. It's a word that it works like an adjective, but the information that it gives you is locational. So it describes a noun. And in this case, transpontine describes somewhere that's on the opposite side of a bridge. So that's the transpontine building over there. And what I love about this is that, there's a whole host of these. There's interlacustrine, which is somewhere that's between two lakes. Transnivean, on the other side of a snowfield. I love these words. But I love transpontine because, apart from the fact that I live near the Tyne Bridge, in the 19th century, when people kind of knew Latin roots probably more than they do now, that word probably wouldn't have puzzled as many people, so it used to be bandied around an awful lot. And the people who used to use it were theatre critics in London, who used to use it to describe the theatres on the south bank of the Thames. So in the West End, you could go and see Shakespeare and, Jacobean tragedies and Greek plays and things. And on the South Bank, you could go and see penny dreadfuls and murder mysteries and freak shows. So transpontine, as well as starting to be used literally, started to be used to mean kind of playing to the gallery, kind of over-exaggerated, kind of lowest common denominator is transpontine. And what I love is that that's nowhere near that word. Transpontine, it's two Latin roots, movement across and bridge. Yeah. But if you look it up in the dictionary, it says exaggerated. Yeah. You go, well, how's that happen? So what you've got in this brilliant word is a complete microcosm of language change and how a word that literally means something can be completely transformed just by people using it. So I love that word and I love the story attached to it. I think that's the one that I come back to. Ask me tomorrow and I'll tell you something else.
Hi.
Hi.
Sorry, I got the phone. I mean the microphone. Right. Actually, on transpontine, I'm Spanish. I have a couple of questions about it. I've lived 28 years in Newcastle upon Tyne.
Oh, really?
Luntun. And I thought the word for transpontine was the bridge. Anyway.
Yeah.
Sorry. There are several questions I wanted to ask, but I'll limit myself to one. I've always considered English as a very
a language which is a master of understatement, right? However, looking at that, the first part of the title, why is this a question? I find that it is an overstatement of it being a question because, first of all, why is a question mark a mark of a question?
Oh, that's a good question, yeah.
Why do you need it if you have inversion? And why do you need it when you have the word why?
Yeah.
So
This is a
you
very
have
good
3
question.
pointers there.
Yeah.
This is a question.
That is a good question.
Well,
But my yes,
That's a really good point.
the main one is why is a question mark the mark of
Yeah.
a question?
This is really good. I talk about punctuation marks and things in the book actually, and they've all got individual stories. There is a theory attached to this that it comes from an I and an O on top of one another that was originally kind of used as a question mark, I think in Latin, in documents and things, and it's sort of slowly morphed over time, largely because, I get sidetracked, I'm sorry, because you need to save space on the line. So if you've got an I and an O next to each other, you can write, and you're using it a lot, you put them on top of one another, and then over time, if you're writing quickly, the I starts to curl a little bit, and instead of drawing a circle, you draw a dot. So it sort of slowly shrinks down over time. If you ended up with this, there is exclamation marks and all sorts of things. There's a Questel theory that it comes from that as well, a Q and all sorts of things. So yeah, we've got that. The question mark at the start, yeah, we do that as well in English, and we get inversions as well. So yeah, it's all a bit of a mismatch in English. But I think it's partly as well to do with the fact that we're just no one has intentionally created the language to be sensible. That's the problem. If you created a language tomorrow, you would make it all really regular, and there would be no story attached to why the alphabet's in the order that it is, because you would create a system that makes sense. I mean, no, we don't even bunch all the vowels together at the start. We just scatter them around. We just kind of do whatever. Yeah. So yeah, because it hasn't been kind of created intentionally, you've ended up with lots of systems that overlap and things that only apply in certain contexts. And yeah, so it's all a bit of a mess. Luckily, English isn't alone in that.
No. Yeah, that's true. Yes, there are some languages indeed which have 2 question marks around questions, don't they?
Yeah.
He says, looking at the question.
And upside down for some reason.
Yes, and an upside down one. Yeah. Other questions? There was one here, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, you asserted that there's no such thing as incorrect spelling.
I know, yeah.
Which I'll let that go. But there is such a thing as standard spelling, and that's really useful.
Yeah.
Are there any languages where standard spelling has never caught on?
There absolutely will be, yeah. Because the odd thing is that there was no concept of a spelling mistake until we had dictionaries. And probably only until we had Johnson's dictionary, which was 1755.
Yeah.
And then probably even 100 years after that, until it had really taken on in schools that there was this standard, this is the spelling that you use. And that kind of, despite that dictionary being kind of flawed, dare I say it, and not including certain words, and his definitions are sometimes questionable. There's one word, I can't remember what it is, he just says, I don't know what it means. It was just like, all right, okay. I could have used that in there. So that dictionary kind of established the standard. And it was very kind of, I'm going to do this in my dictionary. And so suddenly his rules kind of went out across everything. So, but the point was that up until then, there's all sorts of flexibility in the language. And it was the standardization that kind of brought in that's given us the idea of that you can make a spelling mistake. Languages that haven't got that kind of formulation, that haven't got that kind of benchmark, there'll still probably, I would have thought, be an awful lot of flexibility. I mean, everyone looks to Shakespeare. There were, I think, 6 records of him writing his own name, and he spells his name different every single time.
Yeah.
But he could do whatever he wanted. Yeah. But yeah, so there's this idea that yes, there is now a standard because we all have to follow the same rules. There's no point in us having lots and lots of different ways of spelling something, so we do still learn what is right. But it's the kind of capriciousness of that the dictionary kind of brought in.
I think we can take one last question.
Okay, I was just wondering what your opinion is of scholars like Merritt Ruland or Joseph Greenberg, who tend to lump languages together, maybe even think we're all descended from one original language.
It's interesting. One of the things that there's a chapter in the book which is about word order and why we place the words in the order that we do. And I thought I'll tell this from an English perspective. And the more you kind of dig into that, that's one of these things where all the avenues everywhere do come back to one common answer. So in English, we use subject, verb, object. I eat pizza, which I do fairly regularly. The thing that does it, followed by the verb that it's doing, and the thing that's somehow kind of tangentially involved in it. And we kind of think, well, that must be how most languages work. But there are 6 different ways that you can order those 3 things. And you'll find all 6 of them in different languages. And actually, a majority of languages around the world are subject, object, verb. I, pizza, eat. And the theory is that if you trace it, all languages everywhere back to this one kind of common point, that was probably the order that all human language fundamentally had. The reason being, the subject and the object are the things that you can see. And that's the kind of basic information that you need to know. The thing that connects them, you don't really need to know that until you've established what you're going to talk about. It's the equivalent of like, if you try to imagine the verb drive, instantly you've got a picture of someone sat at the wheel of a car. You can't imagine that without a driver and the thing they're driving. It's like trying to imagine what chase looks like. You can't picture it without one thing chasing another. So you need that kind of, those fundamental elements. So the idea is that all human language originally was subject-object. The things went first, and then the thing that connects them went last. The reason why we've diverged away from that, and a lot of other languages have, is because our grammar changed. We dropped case in English and relied much more on the standard order of things to tell you what's happening and who's doing what to what. So we use the verb to split those 2 things up. If you've got a sentence like, the dog chased the cat, if you lump the 2 objects together at the start, in a fast-paced conversation where you've got sentences all following one another, if you say, the dog the cat chased, and you've got a sentence before it and a sentence after it, you could really get that muddled up, because a cat could just as easily have chased the dog. In a sentence like, the lady picked up the baby, you're not going to think that the baby's picked up the lady, so it doesn't happen in all sentences. But in some sentences, it's completely possible that the subject could have done the thing to the object that the object did. So the idea is that we use the verb to split those 2 things up. We developed this other system that went, well, we'll keep him over there and we'll keep that there, and the thing that connects them, we'll put that in the middle to keep them apart. But trace everything back, chances are that every single fundamental language did this one thing right back at the beginning. So it's one of these odd things that actually there is this common kind of bloodline that goes right back to the start, whenever that start happened to be. But yeah, this idea that kind of this thing happened over here, and this thing happened over here, and this happened over there. Actually, there is this one kind of odd common thing that kind of links everything together, fundamentally, right back at the start. I talked on there, sorry.
No, not
looking at the clock.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul.
A pleasure.
I really enjoyed that. It was great fun, and thanks for answering so many questions from everybody. Can we show our appreciation?
Thank you so much.
And he's too shy, so I'll do publicity for this. It's a really, really good read.
It is.
And if you want to get a copy, downstairs in the foyer, the books are on sale, and I believe you will be signing some.
Apparently so, yeah.
Won't you? Thanks ever so much for coming today.
Yeah, thank you.
Really enjoyed having you. Make sure you check out what else is going on in the Festival of Ideas, and have safe journeys home. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.